This month's Where Did the Road Go is sponsored by Allison Cook and Super Inframan. Thank you so very much. And now our show.
Transmission start. Welcome to Where Did the Road Go? Join us as we wander off the path and explore lost history, consciousness, the paranormal, unexplained mysteries, alternative thought, and much more. We are present on the web at wheredidtheroadgo.com. Now here is your host, Seriah.
Welcome to this edition of Where Did the Road Go? And tonight I am joined by Laird Scranton. Hello, Laird.
Hey, Seriah, how are you doing?
And we were just talking. You've been on quite a few times. I'm not even sure how many at this point. At least probably 5 or 6 times.
Yeah, it's getting to be a tradition. That's great.
including the one time that I had, I came out to see you and John Anthony West, too.
Yeah, that was a memorable get-together, and I really miss John, but that's great that we were able to be in his house together and talking, all the three of us.
Yeah, that was one of my favorite moments from this show, honestly. So you have a new book out on intertraditions called Primal Wisdom of the... let me try to speak again. Primal Wisdom of the Ancients, the Cosmological Plan for Humanity.
Right.
And this came out when?
It was just out in July. It's very recent.
Okay. And this is, as with all your books, very, very interesting, very deep. And I mean, I don't even have the right words for it, because you're potentially unlocking an ancient system of how they viewed the universe that might not be wrong. I mean, like, it makes sense to modern science.
Right. As a matter of fact, I'd go farther than that. I would say that looking at the science from the perspective of the ancient tradition dramatically simplifies a lot of the issues. So many of the key stumbling blocks that scientists are tripping over essentially evaporate if you look at it in a different way. Okay.
So, I mean, the idea is that we're dealing with sort of a dual universe that has like two sides to it, a material and a non-material side.
Right. This comes out of the Samkhya philosophy in India. That's the foundation for all of the major religious traditions in India. Samkhya is a companion to yoga, and Samkhya says that universes form in pairs, one less material and one more material. There's like a cycle of energy and matter between the two that it's progressive. So we have one growing more material while the other one grows less material.
Okay, and you talk about how mass affects time in this respect as well.
Right, and that's Einstein, really. I mean, Einstein's major premise here, discovery, is that as mass increases, time frame slows. That's how the speed of light remains constant. If you speed is just the distance traveled divided by the amount of time it took you to travel it. Mm-hmm. So if you were driving along in a Jeep behind a train on a train track or following alongside it, and you speed up, you would expect the relative speed between you and the train to lessen.
Right.
But that doesn't happen with light. No matter how much you speed up, the speed that you measure a speed of light ahead of you at the same constant rate of 186,000 miles per second. And the only way that can happen, mathematically speaking, is if time slows down.
Okay. And you, so what you're saying is that, like, I am, to kind of, I guess, sum up some of this right off the bat, you're saying that these two universes, these pairs of universes that we're in one half of, over the course of the Yuga cycle, which is about 12,000 years, it scrolls from being very material to non-material and then back again.
Right. And the essential difference that creates between the universes rests on how quick time runs, how quick events happen. And so sort of midway through that, between those universes, there are spatial overlaps at every point in space and time where time is running 10,000 times as quickly as it is for us. They've actually measured it. Scientists have done studies where they have compared how long it takes entangled electrons to interact with each other as opposed to unentangled. and it's 10,000 times more quickly than what we experience. So the essential difference that's going on here is quickness of events.
So do you think the entanglement is happening on that other universe?
No, I think entanglement as we experience it is happening in the spaces of the overlap between the universes. This is basically a Vesica Pisces type space. The Buddhists define it in the geometry they use to align a Buddhist stupa shrine. They say that the geometry recapitulates how space actually emerges, and it results in an overlap that is sort of almond shaped like the Vesica Pisces, and it's inside that overlap where entanglement happens, from my point of view.
Okay, all right. And for anyone who is not familiar with some of the stuff we're talking about, they can look up your older interviews on this show, but you have quite a few books kind of pinning down how the Dogon, some of the Buddhist stuff, some of the Judaic stuff, Orkney Island, the Maori, all kind of seem to be drawing from the same ancient system of cosmology.
Right, that, Jung saw he recognized all these similarities in widespread cultures and was trying to come up with an explanation for how that could possibly be. How could places that could never have had physical contact with each other express ideas and concepts of creation and related symbols in matching ways, down to very specific symbolism that associates with certain forms, things that you wouldn't just automatically expect them to invent off the top of their head. And of course, he was a psychiatrist, and as someone once said, if you hire a surgeon, you can expect a surgical solution.
Right.
Well,
right.
Jung came up with a psychological. He boiled it down to collective consciousness or variations on collective consciousness. The ancient cultures that I study represent it in a different way. What they're saying is that they all benefited from a common era of deliberate instruction in ancient times by some group of teachers who understood science very well.
And it wasn't just a matter of that, but you're comparing the language and the root language and showing like that many of the words have double meanings that are not connected, and they have the same double meanings in all of these different cultures.
Right, and that all of the Dogon, the Dogon are a modern-day African tribe who are my sort of entry point into these studies because their society is sort of an umbrella over three ancient traditions, and they have a societal imperative to preserve original forms of those traditions. And so, looking at what they say, they're representing that deliberate instruction happened in ancient times. And they even come down to specifics of what was taught first and why it was taught that way and what the goal of the teachers were and where the teachers God and all sorts of specifics about the instruction. The Buddhists talk about a lot of the same things and are sort of a good way a counterpoint to check what the Dogon references are. With ancient Egypt, we have similar language. And all of the terms of this cosmological tradition, rather than representing a single meaning, they carry a cluster of meanings, and it's those clusters that are preserved from culture to culture that allow a person like me to positively argue that the Dogon word means the same thing as the Egyptian word does because they share these clusters of meanings.
And that's, that's not something that's likely to happen just by coincidence. I mean, I guess maybe because the Dogon and Egyptians might have had a common source anyway, that might happen, but you're seeing it in other cultures as well.
Right. I mean, Sanskrit language is very different from the Dogon language, but when you compare a single cosmological concept between the Dogon and the Buddhists, you discover that the same clusters of concepts group together.
Yeah.
Under Sanskrit phonetics and under Dogon phonetics, even though they aren't the same phonetics, you can predict the clusters. And so, as an example, the Dogon creator character in their myths is called Amma. Amma grasps and holds things firm, energy firm, and establishes. The word Amma means refers to a hidden god. Well, they go to Egypt, it's Amen, And Amen is the hidden God, but the word also means to grasp or to hold firm or to establish. Even in Hebrew, the word Amen at the end of a Hebrew prayer comes from a root that means to establish.
Yeah. Okay. And that's really fascinating that you have that sort of double meaning there that transcends these different cultures.
Well, the effect is, when you get down to the bottom of the effect is really a consequence of the relationship between the universes. It's the same effect that we see with white light producing a rainbow of colors, or of a single tone producing 7 notes of music. Anything that crosses that boundary between non-materiality and materiality expresses itself in those kinds of clusters. And so that upholds the Dogen idea that these concepts of creation really, the seeds of them really persist on the non-material side, not on the material side. That everything of substance persists on the non-material side.
And why do you think these cultures found it so important to preserve this knowledge?
That's a book-length answer. But the upshot is that we have time quickening on one side of, in one universe, while time is slowing down in the other universe. So now if you imagine a point where the non-material side is as less material, it has as little materiality to it as possible, time has to be running infinitely quickly there. So quickly there that there's no moment in which an action can be taken. All events essentially happen at once. And so Samkhya says the non-material, a fully non-material universe has perfect knowledge because all events have happened at once, but it also has no ability to act because there's no moment in which to take action.
Right. And
so that state for the universe is comparable to a medical situation for a person called locked-in syndrome. There's a famous book that was written and made into a movie by a Frenchman. It's called The Diving Bell and the Butterfly. It's about a man who was thought to be brain dead in France, who actually was fully conscious in there, but nobody knew it. And eventually he was able, through a series of eye blinks, he could still blink his eyelids. They thought they were random blinks, but finally one of his attendants figured out they weren't random, that he was trying to communicate. And from that point on, he ended up, she embedded a system with him to indicate one letter at a time. And he wrote this entire book one letter at a time through a series of eye blinks.
Wow.
So the situation with the universes is that the side that's becoming less material figures out that that's where it's headed, to the equivalent of that the non-materiality is essentially going to be locked in with no ability whatsoever to communicate, but perfect consciousness. And the only way that's not like being buried alive is if you have a compatriot who knows you're in there.
Right.
And so it tries to set up a structure for humanity on the material side so that at the point where the two universes are most distanced from each other, there'll be a group of us who still understand that the non-material side's there.
And so from your description of this, the universes sort of scroll between material and non-material. So what does that mean for our universe in, say, 6,000-7,000 years?
Well, from my perspective, okay, from the traditional perspective in Buddhism or Hinduism, we're about 1,000 years into the ascending side, which is the side of materiality becoming less and less and less.
Right.
But based on the references I get from the comparative cultures I look at, it looks like we've just now passed the bottom of the cycle. We've just now passed out of the phase where we're becoming more material and into a phase where we're becoming less material. So now one of the consequences of this scrolling energy, if you think of it in terms of sand in an hourglass, it begins in the top globe and sifts slowly through into the bottom globe. Well, there's going to be a point in that process where the amount of sand in the top globe equals the amount of sand in the bottom globe.
Right.
Well, at that point, the time frames of the two universes should equalize. And so theoretically, you have a situation where it might be possible to cross over from one to the other.
Mm.
And that's what the Dogon say happened around 3600 BC, is that a deliberate choice was made by a group of teachers to cross over between the universes into the material universe and organize a framework for society for us and a framework for education for us that would have the effect of preserving the knowledge of non-materiality once we're at the stage we're at right now. And that's the system that I'm exploring, is a system they set up.
Okay, but what happens to this universe past that sort of like, I mean, it seems like we have a continuous material history, I guess is what I'm saying.
Well, the same thing is true of non-materiality. If the only real difference is quickness of time frame, it's sort of like boiling a lobster, that while you're in it, things seem normal every second. That looking at, okay, if you look at, let's say, there's a famous tribe that was raised in a valley. There for thousands of years, they lived in a valley, and they never had any visible distance that they could look at anything in. And when the first time they were taken out of that valley, and they noticed sheep up on a mountainside, they couldn't be convinced that those weren't tiny sheep. Well, the same thing is true looking at non-materiality from a distance. That with the quickness of time frame, it looks to us like unity. But from their perspective, it may not look substantially different than our reality looks to us.
Mm.
Now, there's a suggestion that the effect that happens with a black hole, which is to slow time frame, is essentially the same effect that happens with wave collapse at the quantum level. Only we're seeing the black hole from the perspective, from the opposite perspective. We're looking at it from the perspective of the quicker time frame that's now being slowed. Okay. Well, that's what's happening in the quantum world, is essentially we're taking whatever happens at the level of waves and dramatically slowing the time frame that it's in.
Okay, all right. It's a hard concept to wrap your brain around.
Not that there's any tangible difference that we're going to perceive. It's just that events are going to start to happen quicker and quicker and quicker and quicker and quicker. We do see the effect of that. Scientists can't figure out why it looks as if the rate of expansion of the universe is speeding up.
Mm.
Well, from the perspective of the system I'm working with, it isn't speeding up. We're seeing the effect of the slowing of our own time frame. That because events are transpiring more slowly for us, it makes it look to us as if a constant expansion rate is increasing in speed when it's not. And so you have all this work being done trying to find a theory of dark energy that could explain what's speeding up the expansion of the universe, when what's really happening is time is just slowing down because we're becoming more massive.
So there's also the idea of the Yuga cycle and the Great Year and such, and how when we enter that golden age, we have sort of like unlimited psychic ability and stuff like that at the top point of that, where what would be to us the immaterial side. Right.
Well, the change, the distancing in time frames, the difference in time frame between the two, seems to cause us on the material side not to be able to perceive things non-material. But even recently, you're seeing scientific reports of suddenly they're discovering things they had never noticed before. They now see the effects of what looks like a second universe pressing up against ours way out there. Mm-hmm. They're seeing new forms of light. They're seeing new types of particles of matter. They're detecting all sorts of things they'd never detected before that may all be part of this range of things that we haven't been able to perceive that suddenly we're able to again. You see, if you pay attention to reports about the fairy tradition in the United Kingdom, that even in the 1800s, people who wrote about it were saying, our great grandparents were far better able than we are to perceive these effects.
Right.
Well, imagine that there's actually something going on here, and that our ability to perceive it is what's changed, not anything else. That all of those interactions with fairy type creatures, a range of fairy type creatures, might have been real things.
Yeah.
That we now poo-poo it because we can't measure it. But as we see this movement up the ascending cycle, eventually we're going to be able to perceive those things again.
So, okay, that makes sense. And you talk about synchronicities being a part of that too.
Right. I mean, even Stomka says everyday coincidences are a thing. They can't point to every coincidence and say, oh, there's meaning to this. But there are things you can point to when it is a meaningful communication that verifies that. There tends to be self-confirmation in meaningful synchronicities. They don't just happen once, they keep happening.
Right.
That you see the same odd reference in completely unexpected contexts.
Yeah.
You see it on television, and then suddenly you bump into the same thing in the grocery store. Well, self-confirmation of meaning is one of the key aspects of all of that. Samkhya says that because non-materiality has no ability to take action on its own, it's routinely trying to induce action on the material side, or trying to communicate knowledge or induce action. And it does so through certain effects. One is through the auspices of vivid dreams. Another is through the unusual behavior of animals. Through synchronicities, what we consider to be coincidences, through clairvoyance, and through non-material paranormal sorts of effects that all of us wonder about.
Yeah, I was going to say it could be any aspect of the paranormal that might that might affect.
Right. And if you talk to people who experience these odd things, everybody has their own story of what they've experienced and when they experienced it and how they experienced it. It's not like it fits neat little patterns. Kabbalism identifies between a half a dozen and a dozen categories of what they call mystics, based on how things are experienced. One class of mystics experiences things through hallucinogenic drugs. Another class of mystics experiences things through clairvoyance. Another through divination. So there's a range of way that things are perceived or communicated. Even the effect of UFOs, UFO contacts, and UFO witnesses play out in terms of the system of symbolism I'm talking about.
And a lot of the paranormal, especially when we get into the high strangeness stuff, fits into that symbolism as well. Right.
And the symbolism aligns with the system I'm working with. So very often, if a person can express to me the details of a vivid dream they had, what images they saw and how it made them feel, and any particular words that they associate with the experience of the dream, and what kinds of actions happen in the dream, I can go to an Egyptian hieroglyphic dictionary and discover that each of those elements relates to a cluster of words that are pronounced a certain way.
Huh. Okay. So it's almost okay. So what you're saying, sort of like they'll all be related in this cluster.
Right. They express themselves in terms of those same clusters of discrete but related meanings.
Huh.
When I say discrete, I mean the clusters are such that knowing one of the elements in the cluster doesn't give you any leg up on guessing what the other elements are.
And so what would be the message that's trying to be conveyed there through these dreams if it's just giving you a cluster?
Well, let's say there are 7 meanings associated with a phonetic value, and the person hit on 6 of those in their dream.
Okay.
The 7th one typically is the one that I identify as being the message of the dream.
Okay.
That happened to me. The entire book fell out for me because one day in July in like 2014 or 15, something like that, I thought I was researching half a dozen different questions about language for friends, various friends and contacts. And on this one morning, all 6 of those questions resolved through a set of words in a single column on a single page of the Egyptian hieroglyphic dictionary. They were all related words, related phonetically. And the 7th word in that column on that page was a word for pillar that also means embrace. It gave me a clue I needed to sort out what the carved arms on the Gobekli Tepe pillars represented.
And what is that?
It represents the concept of an embrace, which is central. It's one of the central symbols of how the energies of these universes come together in a familial embrace or a warm, loving embrace between friends.
Okay.
Now, understanding that opened up an entire book's worth of information for me. There was a whole range of things connected to that produced my book, A Point of Origin.
Mm-hmm.
But I was able to sit down and write the book in about 3 months' time because I had all these loose ends that I didn't know where they belonged, but now suddenly they pulled together because of this one word on this one page that was pointed to by these other meanings that I was researching for other people.
Now, Gobekli Tepe would have been more toward the Golden Age. I mean, being 10 to 12,000 years old.
It would almost half a cycle back from us. It's 1,000 years or so after the counterpoint to where we're at right now. End of the Ice Age basically is the opposite side of the cycle from us.
Right. So what? I'm trying to phrase this properly. Like, why is that stuff encoded there if we would be in the non-material side at that point?
Well, we weren't. At that point, we were about as far into the material side as Buddhism thinks we're to the non-material side now. We're about 1,000 years in. But the Ice Age did a number on us. Any establishment of civilization that had been done before the Ice Age pretty much got wiped out by the effects of the Ice Age.
Right, yeah.
Okay, so your and my friend John Anthony West, his perspective was the same as Graham Hancock's, that instruction that occurred in the era of Gobekli Tepe was probably carried out by survivors of a prior civilization after the end of the Ice Age. I see reasons to think that that's true.
Okay.
So whoever that was put together the beginnings of this symbolic system that carries forward for 12,000 years to where we are right now.
That makes sense to me. I mean, I think they're probably right in that respect. I mean, it makes a lot of sense. And Gobekli Tepe really was sort of the nail in the coffin of the idea that there wasn't something before that.
Right, that's right. I mean, John and his geologist friend, academic Robert Schoch from Boston University, were the ones who made the argument to the American Geological Society that the Sphinx had to be a lot older than anybody thought it was based on rainwater weathering.
Yeah.
But the argument against that was, well, that can't possibly be because there was no organized effort at megalithic construction prior to around 3000 BC. Well, Gobekli Tepe sort of tosses that in the ash can, because here, 12,000 years ago, we see brilliantly executed carvings of animals in stone pillars, and a repeating series of stone circles of stone pillars that, based on some references, there was a wooden stupa shrine sitting at the center of those pillars.
Really? Okay.
Or comparable to a stupa shrine.
I guess the part I'm trying to wrap my brain around is the sort of, when we hit that point of complete non-materiality, what is our universe like? I mean, because it seems like there's always some level of materialism in our universe.
Right. There has to be. If you think that the time associates with mass, nothing can transpire if we don't have a framework of time first. Time's got to be the first dimension. And
Okay.
so, even at its least material, the non-material universe still has to have some matter, and it still has to have a dimension of time.
Okay.
It just from our perspective, it looks like it's fully non-material. It's like from where we sit, there's a smallest unit increment that we can measure. We have a Planck length that is the smallest thing that we can measure.
Mm-hmm.
And my feeling is the constraint is our time framework.
Okay.
Okay, it's not that there's an inherent limit scientifically. It's that given the tools we have access to, that's the smallest we can measure.
Now, this cosmology is not, how do you put it? It's not hidden from the masses, but it's only available to people who are proper initiates for it.
Well, from the non-material side's perspective, what it's trying to do is it's basically a job interview for companions and caretakers for itself. So it's looking for sincere caretakers who can be counted on to be persistent and to continue to take the things they learn seriously. And so the esoteric tradition, actually from my point of view, the esoteric tradition, which is the instruction of initiates by informants, is modeled after the mode of communication between the universes. That it's basically accustoming an initiate to working in that framework. The way the Dogon handle it is, it's the student's job to ask the next question that's pertinent to their own knowledge. And as long as they frame a question that's appropriate to the next stage of their knowledge, their informant is required to give them a truthful answer to the question.
Yeah. But
And
go ahead.
and if it's not appropriate to where they're at, the informant is required to remain silent or to lie if they have to. But the whole idea is to enlist people who are have a genuine, sincere interest in learning this stuff, who are going to be self-motivated to continue to learn about it.
But they'll also hide that the tradition exists to some people.
Yes and no. Okay, one of the problems the Dogons say that their teachers had in trying to put the system together was they felt that humanity needed to be drawn to culture as a moth is drawn to a flame.
Mm-hmm.
Well, somebody figured out that humans really like a mystery.
That's true.
And that if you want to keep somebody interested over a long period of time, give them what looks like an insoluble mystery, and they'll just keep pushing at it. How many thousands of years have people been trying to figure out what the pyramids are about?
Yeah.
So the mystery aspect of it, from one point of view, is this is part of the attraction that keeps this group of sincere initiates actively trying to pursue this knowledge.
But you also
there's another side to it. Yeah, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Well, there's another side to it in that when you get down to the era of the jealous God in Judaism, the first precept of the jealous God is that humanity will have no other gods before him. So that precept makes it look as if there's a second group who was not as keen on humanity learning this stuff as the first group was. So the secrecy may also pertain to that. There could be an aspect of it that's there's somebody else out there we don't want knowing that we're actively educating humans.
Yeah, and why would that be, though? That was going to be my next question. Like, you say that there's hints of a group that would oppose this knowledge or subvert it in some way.
Well, I mean, that comes down to simple everyday politics. You know, we see counter motives on the parts of groups all the time throughout history, where one group seems to be leaning more towards the best interests of the populace, and the other group is working against it.
Yeah, with more selfish means.
That's no different. They were just saying that among the groups that are non-human, which, from the perspective of the traditions I'm working with, there are a number of those. Some of them not in, some of those interdimensional, and some of those off planet. That there could be competition among those groups.
But you also say that, like with the Dogon, when they had some other anthropologists went in there and they were told there was no cosmological tradition or no secret teachings.
Right. Now the Dogon, the Dogon were studied by two of France's leading anthropologists starting in the 1930s. This is actually Marcel Griol is described as the premier anthropologist of Europe in that era. He was the one who was at the cutting edge. He was the first one to be using film to document things and tape recordings to document things. He brought teams into Dogon country every year for the better part of 3 decades to document the Dogon cosmology. Let's see. I've lost the trail of what your question was.
Oh, how the follow up to that? They basically found no.
Oh, right. Okay, so Griol described the Dogon as preserving a closely held secret tradition, and that is true. If I were to walk into a Dogon village, find the priest of the village, and start asking leading questions about the cosmology, he would deny knowing anything about it. So Griol studied the Dogon for 30 years, then ending in around 1956 when he died. In the 1980s, a second anthropological team went back in for a few years, ostensibly to restudy Griol's work. But over the course of a few years, they were undertaking the highly unusual action of trying to completely restudy a guy's work that had happened over a series of decades. Mm-hmm. And so the group was led by an anthropologist named Walter Van Beek out of Belgium, whose specialty was ecology, not even religion. And he brings a team in, and they start asking leading questions of everybody in the Dogon villages, including the top priests, about Griol's cosmological tradition, and they're all told no such thing exists. Nobody knows anything about it. I say what Van Beek managed to replicate was the experience of a parent who goes to a college campus on Parents' Weekend and comes away having seen no evidence of drug or alcohol use.
Right.
So, I mean, Griol flatly said that's the way the tradition works. And there are other cultures like the Maori in New Zealand where it's documented that that's the way their esoteric tradition works. An outsider can't expect to come in asking leading questions and be told anything.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit about the Great Pyramid, because you mentioned this a few times. And you actually compare it to sort of the stupa type of thing. Pyramids in general, you compare them to the stupas in the Dokkan and Buddhist tradition a bit.
Yes, and actually that stupa was pivotal in undercutting what Professor Van Beek had to say. What he missed was, Van Beek said to me in an email, he said that the Dogon shrine that I compared to a Buddhist stupa was a chimera known only to Griol. In other words, this is a construct that Griol made up. Mm-hmm. But what he missed was abiding commonalities between the Dogon Granary Shrine and a Buddhist stupa, which is known all over Asia and India. So, and not only does the shrine compare to what the Dogon describe, but the cosmology that goes with the shrine is a match for the cosmology the Dogon associate with their shrine. So Van Beek's perspective was he was claiming that the Dogon priests had casually invented answers to the questions Griol was asking and basically lied to him the whole way through. But if we believe that, then the Dogon casually invented Buddhism, because we have direct comparability between the Dogon cosmology and the Buddhist cosmology.
Right.
That can't be. So I ended up writing an article. I had originally offered to co-author an article with Van Beek to announce that. I figured if you're going to contradict a guy's work, the least you can do is let him take the lead on contradicting it.
Yeah.
But he deferred on that, so I ended up writing an article myself for Anthropology News back in 2007 that basically said that, look, Van Beek's team missed how the Dogon shrine that Griol describes connects to the Buddhist shrine and how both of them produce the same symbolic cosmology. This can't be a fake tradition. It has to be a real one.
And how does this compare to like the pyramids in Egypt?
Well, the Dogon shrine has a lot of elements that compare favorably to a pyramid, a traditional Egyptian pyramid. In both cases, the Dogon and the Buddhist shrines are really only theoretical constructs. A Buddhist stupa is not allowed to be used for any functional purpose. This is supposed to be a symbolic shrine. The Dogon shrine is even more theoretical than that, because the Dogon draws a picture of what it's supposed to look like, and they give us specific instructions for how it's supposed to be built, what dimensions are supposed to be measured where, and so forth. But those instructions enfold an internal contradiction such that the shrine can't be built, and look the way they represent it. Something what they're doing is they're reconciling the figure of a circle with a square, and so the Dogon shrine begins with a circular base that measures 10 cubits from the center out to the edge, a radius of 10 cubits. That rises to a square roof that measures 8 cubits per side. Now we know that the Dogon dimensions are likely to be original because they include self-confirmation of numbers. That roof that measures 8 cubits per side produces an area of 64 square cubits. The circular base produces a circumference that measures 64 cubits if we use 3.2 as a value of pi, rounded value of pi.
Mm-hmm.
So we have cross-confirming numbers there to say, guess what, folks? Nobody messed with these dimensions because they match.
Right, but they don't work in the real world.
But in the real world, they don't work because what the Dogon are describing is a shrine that rises to that square roof with staircases up the center of each of 4 flat sides with 10 steps each. But if we were going to actually lay it out in practicality, because it's only 10 cubits in radius, those staircases would have to meet at a peak, not at a flat roof.
Okay.
Or else you'd have to move the staircases out 4 cubits from the side of the granary to make it work out to the correct roof. Well, Imhotep, in constructing the Great Pyramid, had to reconcile a similar dispute among the priests of Egypt. We're not told what the dispute is, but the way he resolved it was by placing the figure of the Ben stone on a flat roof to produce a peak. In other words, he was resolving the same kind of a dispute. He had one group of priests saying, you can't build a flat top pyramid because it has to come to a peak based on the definition of the dimensions. And the other side saying, no, you can't use the dimensions. You have to produce the flat roof.
Okay.
And so he resolved that by saying, come on, folks, we're going to ignore all this dispute. We'll put a Ben stone on top to bring it to a peak and satisfy both groups.
You talk about Ed Nightingale's work briefly and his mathematics of the Giza Plateau. How does that fit into your work?
Really very well. I mean, as a matter of fact, my wife Risa and I worked with Ed in trying to produce the book from the 20 years of material that he had researched. He was trying to pull it all together in the form of a book that he could publish. And so we spent a couple of weekends with him talking things through and discussing the best way to present certain ideas and to express certain thoughts and to put it in sort of a readable sequence. But what he's doing is he's working from a plan that, again, reconciles the figure of a circle with the figure of a square that begins with Platonic numbers, Platonic sequences of numbers, and evokes every kind of scientific number you can think of, from the musical scale to the speed of light. And one of the factors involved with that, you might be aware that the faces of the Great Pyramid are not actually flat faces. They involve an indent.
Yep.
Well, the difference in measure between what you would measure across the flat side of that pyramid and what you have to measure if you include the indent is the ratio between pure tones in the musical scale and the tones that actually sound right to our ears if you play them.
Huh.
If you measure it out mathematically, you get what the pure tone should be, but they sound off to us musically. You have to adjust them by a factor to get the right tones, and that's that same factor between the indent and the flat side of the pyramid. The pyramid has a bunch of other features that correspond to the Dogon. It opens 2/3 of the way up the north side of the structure. Symbolically, it can represent the womb of a woman lying on her back, just the Dogon shrine can. The faces of the pyramids around the world, in some cultures, preserve symbolism where the faces are associated with star groups that regulate the agricultural cycle. The Dogon have that feature. Number of other things. The Dogon shrine is understood to represent a hemisphere, which is symbolic of mass or materiality, and the Great Pyramid is also understood to accurately replicate by a factor the dimensions of the Earth,
Right.
as a hemisphere. So there are all sorts of commonalities there. Ed's stuff goes into much more detail. He's working from satellite images that are corrected for parallax that are accurate down to centimeters.
Oh, wow.
And he compares his measurements to the 3 major surveys that were done of the Giza Plateau over time, and he discovers that certain key dimensions in those surveys were misstated. It looks like they were deliberately misstated. Sometimes they're off by 30 feet.
Huh. Why would they deliberately mislabel them like that?
Because if you misstate one of the key measures, somebody can't do what Ed did with it, which is figure out that it represents science. There are scientific values being represented, and again, being represented with self-confirmation, the same value represented in 3 different units of measure, once in cubits, once in meters, once in inches.
Gotcha. Okay. Huh. One of the things you touch on is some of the relation to string theory in the Dogon work, but string theory is very unproven at this point. What if that turns out not to be a thing?
Well, from my point of view, string theory is a misdirection. Someone came up with an approach to researching this stuff that no one is ever going to solve. That's not the way to go about it. Math is really not the way to go about it. Einstein, all of Einstein's insights came from qualitative work, not quantitative, and it was only later that someone proved them quantitatively.
Okay.
The problem with addressing these issues from a perspective of mathematics is that as you work your way back to the origination point of the Big Bang, the math breaks down. You end up with dividing by 0 or dividing into infinity, and the math no longer functions. You can't solve it mathematically.
Mm-hmm.
The Dogon viewpoint on it is a qualitative one, like Einstein's is. And looked at qualitatively, all of those contradictions evaporate. They go away. You no longer have a situation where things boil down to probabilities or things boil down to mathematical values that you can't work with.
Okay. You talk a lot about Sirius, and of course, a lot of people probably know the Dogon because of the ancient astronaut theory that people from Sirius instructed them, which is not what the Dogon actually said.
That's not my perspective on it. At first, that was my impulse too, that Sirius must be important because their teachers came from there. But it turns out Sirius is absolutely important, but not for that reason. We're all familiar with the Hermetic statement, as above, so below.
Mm-hmm.
And the implication that if we understood things properly, we'd see that processes in the macrocosm, in the universe that we see sort of conceptually above us, are in some way fundamentally similar to processes in the microcosm below us. Well, the Dogon say that's flatly true. From the Dogon perspective, there are a handful of dynamics of energy that repeat in parallel form all the way up the scale, that if you understand how they work on one level, you can predict how they work on the next level. Now, to illustrate that idea, there's a little bit of a complicated process here, but it leads us to an intuitive understanding of how that works. The Dogon talk about a spiral of matter that exists at every point in space-time. They call it the egg of the world. It's called the Po Pilu.
Okay.
Now, the Dogon make the ritual practice of placing large stones on a plateau to represent stars that are important in their cosmological tradition, including the belt stars of Orion. And we know that Robert Bauval, who is also a friend, made note of the fact that the placement of the 3 large pyramids on Giza mimic the placement of the 3 belt stars of Orion.
Right.
And so he developed what he calls the Orion correlation theory, proposing that those pyramids were placed to deliberately reflect the image of those 3 belt stars. What he didn't give us was a compelling rationale for why someone would do that, but he noticed that there's a resemblance there. So that's one of the starting points of information to work from with the Dogon material. In one of the Dogon myths, there's a character named Ogo who plays the role of light. And one of the Ogo is a word that corresponds to an ancient Egyptian word, Aku, that means light, and that is the name of an Egyptian god of light. As a matter of fact, I'm getting ahead of myself. One of the things Ogo does is he measures out the universe. Right. And he measures it out in 8 billion steps. Now, I know that the word step is one of the definitions of a cubit. That there are 2 definitions of a cubit. One is the length of your forearm from your elbow to the tip of your middle finger. The other is the average pace or step of a person. Mm. Well, I know that the universe is much, much larger than 8 billion cubits in size.
Right.
But one of the figures that is, at least in the past, has fairly commonly been given for the radius of the visible universe is 8 billion light years.
Yeah.
So I thought someone is setting up a correspondence, a correlation between the concept of a cubit and the concept of a light year. Hmm. So then I go to the Egyptian hieroglyphic dictionary to look at Egyptian words for cubit, hoping I can find out something more about this. And I discover one of the terms was Aku Meh. Aku is a word for light, Ogo, and Meh is a word for measure or cubit. So here in the Egyptian word, we have expressed as a compound word the meaning of a light year, a light measure.
Right.
So then I ask myself, how was it that we knew the size of an Egyptian cubit? Well, we inferred the size of Egyptian cubits from the dimensions of the Great Pyramid. The Great Pyramid measures 440 royal cubits per side of its square base and 280 royal cubits high. So I'm sitting here I arrive at that point with, a handful of facts to work from. So out of desperation, I go to Google and I type in Orion 440 280, and I turn up references to a structure, a spiraling birthplace of stars known as Barnard's Loop. Yeah. It's so very faint that you can't see it without time-lapse photography, but it centers on the belt stars of Orion. And the Dogon say that their purpose in placing stones on the plateau to represent the belt stars is to point us to a structure they call the chariot of Orion. Well, when you image Barnard's Loop using time-lapse photography, you produce an image that looks like the wheel of a chariot that Orion the Hunter is standing in. But better yet, the dimensions of Barnard's Loop in light years are 440 light years by 280 light years. And the scientific definition of Barnard's Loop, it's classed as a stellar bubble, is word for word how the Dogon described the tiny spiral of matter that they say exists at every point in space-time. So in other words, Barnard's Loop is one of the structures sitting within our view where you can objectively correlate the above structure with the below structure, the way the Dogon describe it. It's the same structure. It just is happening on different scales.
Okay. All right.
Now, the belt stars of Orion point to, if you look up in the sky, one of the ways of locating Sirius in the night sky is to imagine a line to the belt stars and follow it downward to the left towards the brightest star in the night sky, which is Sirius. Sirius becomes important from my point of view, not because the Dogon teachers came from there, but because there are two main Sirius stars there. There's a bright sun-like star and a dark dwarf star, and the dynamic of those two stars is illustrates a dynamic of energy called angular impulse. This is one of the starting points for how material energies create material structures, or how energies, what the Dogon would describe as a non-material energy and a material energy coming together, create material structures.
Okay.
So the Sirius stars are another example of how you can equate what happens above to what happens below, because the dynamics of energy are a match.
And I'm sure I've asked you this before, but do you think there's any connection between that and the possibility that Sirius is in a binary relationship with our star, like the Sirius group or Walter Cruttendon have suggested?
Yeah, I don't accept that as being true. I do believe that there's a cycle that we're caught up in, and that Sirius is also caught up in, that equates to the rotation of the Yuga cycle, which is one of the things that Walter and Uwe Hohmann and his father are putting forward. Mm-hmm. But I don't believe that it's because of a binary relationship between Sirius and the sun. Instead, what I think is going on, and the reason I don't believe that is because I don't see any evidence that gravitational effects work at that great a distance of 8 or 12 light years, whatever it is, distant. What I do believe is that Barnard's Loop as a structure rotates, the spiral rotates, and that structure has enough gravitational influence to draw our solar system and other star groups along with it.
Okay.
And based on Buddhist references, I believe that Sirius sits at the center of that rotation, which is why, from our perspective, Sirius doesn't precess. Precession is the apparent rotation of all these stars around us, very slow rotation. It takes them 70 years to move a degree.
Right.
Well, that rotation is normally attributed to a slow wobble in the Earth's rotation. But if you've ever sat on a child's merry-go-round in a park, you realize that if you're standing at the edge of that spinning merry-go-round, that everything around you spins. There's not anything that doesn't spin. That's the way the stars should look to us if precession was the consequence of a wobble of ours. Yeah. Everything would precess. We shouldn't have stars like Sirius that don't precess. According to Schwaller de Lubitz, Sirius is the only star that doesn't precess.
Right.
And now, it does make sense if you were ever on one of those merry-go-rounds with another child who is sitting in the center of the merry-go-round while you are at the edge, you'll recall that everything around you spins except the child who's sitting in the center.
Yeah.
Well, that's the relationship we see with Sirius. Sirius is sitting at the center of a rotation that I believe is being evoked by the spinning of Barnard's Loop, and we're being carried around in that rotation.
Interesting. Okay. You also point out the importance of equinoxes.
Right. This comes back to the difference in time frame and mass between the universes. That the point, okay, if you consider the effects of differences of time frame to be similar to the effects of water pressure. We know that when a person is in a submarine and they want to move outside into the greater water pressure of the very, very much greater water pressure of the deep ocean, that for them to be able to do that, they have to enter an airlock first, and they step into the airlock, they equalize the pressure in the airlock with what it is outside, and then they can safely step out. Same thing in space. You step into the airlock, equalize the pressure with what it is outside the spaceship, and then you can safely step out. Well, the equinox does that in terms of time frames for the universes. It's the point at which the equivalent of pressure, water pressure, that's created by these differences in time frame equalizes. And at that point, it becomes safe to move from one to the other. And so the equinox becomes a focus of all these ancient traditions because that's one of the key focal points we need to keep our eye on the ball of. It's one of the bullseyes of the target. The ancient Egyptian word for the equinox was Keper. Keper is the dung beetle whose symbolism was non-existence coming into existence. At the fall equinox, Judaism celebrates Passover, a holiday. And at the end of a traditional Passover Seder, the celebrants of the Seder open a door to the outside to allow a non-material entity named Eliyahu to imaginarily enter the room. In other words, Judaism is acting out the very thing that I say the Dogon are claiming happens at the equinox, which is essentially you open a gateway between non-materiality and materiality, and the group of Dogon teachers came across.
Okay, and this may have been the same for like Orkney Island and stuff like
that.
Right,
that's the same era as Orkney Island. I see the Orkney era of instruction as having been carried out by the Dogon teachers. They're called the Numo. Nu-ma in ancient Egyptian hieroglyphic language means waves perceived phonetically. Which is essentially what the Dogon teachers are considered to be. They're originally non-material, which to us looks wave-like, but able to suddenly to take form, material form.
But wasn't Orkney Island quite a while after where the Dogon were contacted?
No, actually, the Dogon connections to the ancient Egyptians is around that same era.
Okay.
The Orkney influences started happening around 3600 BC or after. Ancient Egypt, the dynastic Egypt appears around 3000 BC, at the same moment that you have agriculturally based kingships appearing in China, in Ireland, and in South America. In Egypt, the term referred to that was Taru. In China, it was Iru. In Ireland, it was Aru, and in South America, it was Peru.
So this would be the point of equinox then, around that time period where they were able to cross over and teach us.
Right. If you calculate 12,000 years back from us, the middle of that ends up being around 3600 BC, which is about the same time as the start of the Hebrew calendar. I think the current Hebrew year is 5779, maybe.
Okay. So if we look back at Gobekli Tepe, though, again, that should be in the non-material time period. Why are
no? Actually, for us, it's in the very early material era for us.
Okay, but we'd still be in the more non-material than material.
Well, symbolically, we were. If you, for example, this is how the Dogon shrine relates to the Buddhist stupa shrine. The Dogon shrine sits on a circular base, which in that archaic era, circularity, which associates with non-materiality, would go along with the less material universe, which would have been us at that stage, as you say. And so a circular base is a proper representation sitting on the earth in that era. And that's why the enclosures at Gobekli Tepe are circular. But as we move on through time, by the time you get to the era of dynastic Egypt, structures are being built with square bases, not round bases.
So does the other universe have the same sort of existence that we do?
the implication is that during the eras when they are more material than we are, they do. And
Okay.
if you imagine imagine the continuum of mass and time frame. As mass gets less, time frame quickens. There's no point along that continuum of increasing mass or decreasing mass for anything to ever deviate.
Right.
So,
Right.
so the suggestion is that things continue to be experienced the way we experience them. They just don't look like that from our point of view.
Which, of course, brings in the whole question of things like free will again. Anytime you deal with time, it kind of does, because if you're experiencing everything all at once, you're not making any choices. And since we have mass and we're experiencing it sequentially, do we have choices, or is it still locked in? We're just experiencing it differently.
That is really easily answered, because Samkhya says that there are routine attempts from the non-material side to induce action on the material side. If we don't have free will, why would they need to induce action?
Fair enough. Okay. All right.
So there has to be a degree of free choice.
And that would also explain, like, if that is the sort of source of a lot of paranormal experiences, why sometimes they're out of time, like they sort of don't understand the time frame that they're
Right.
interacting with us in.
Yeah, and why things like Rip Van Winkle felt that he was away for a short amount of time, but decades had passed when he came back.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's very common in the fairy tradition, is this out of time sync stuff, that there was an era in which if someone was taken by the fairies and you return back to that same spot a year later, you could interact with them again.
Right.
So yes, absolutely. Time also, let's see, I think it was Washington Irving who wrote Rip Van Winkle, or what, or maybe it was, no, I can't remember who it was who wrote the Rip Van Winkle story, but his father was from Orkney.
Interesting. The degree of anthropomorphism in some of the symbolism too is very strong. I know you referenced John Anthony West's showing how different temples in Egypt are set up in this anthropomorphic sort of structure.
Right. Okay, the first place that we see this obviously expressed is on Orkney, that all of the original, on Orkney they built houses out of stone, which is why they survived. And the reason they built them out of stone is because they had readily available flat stones that were easily broken, easily lifted, fairly easily transported, that they could build houses out of. They were like pre-made bricks. So they would build structures, flat wall, or drywall construction, which is stones simply laid flat together without mortar.
Mm-hmm.
Now, all of the original houses at the Skara Brae village on Orkney Island in northern Scotland at around 3200 BC were built to a single plan. And that plan happens to match a plan of a stone house the Dogon build. Although the Dogon don't typically build from stone these days, they build out of mud. When they do build from stone, they build to what's arguably the same plan, and they do so for cosmological reasons that they can express. They say the plan represents the body of a sleeping woman or a sleeping goddess. It includes a round room at one end that represents her head, two side rooms that are rectangular that represent her arms, a center room that's square that represents her body cavity, and sort of a rectangular room at the bottom that is the entryway that represents her sexual parts. Now, one difference is that the Skara Brae houses include a hearth. My original perspective in trying to explore this was I was seeing Dogon or Egyptian influences on Skara Brae, on Orkney, in the era of 3200 BC, and I thought it was remarkable that when they added the hearth, they did it in keeping with the symbolism of the house. They put it where the heart of the sleeping goddess ought to be.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't until later on, when I bumped into a number of other contradictions, that I realized I had it backwards, that the Scar-Bray house was the original form of that architecture, and the Dogon had simply removed the hearth because they lived in a climate where they didn't need a fireplace in the house.
Right, right. What do you think this other universe is trying to communicate to us?
Well, that's an interesting question. First and foremost, the big money is on simple awareness of the fact that it's there.
Okay.
Okay, but are more subtle things going on than that. For instance, the energetic dynamic, and other aspects of the dynamic of communication between non-materiality and materiality is a close parallel for the way that hemispheres of a brain communicate with each other. Mm. And the pattern of non-materiality to materiality, that that locked-in state that the non-material universe eventually finds itself in, is a parallel to REM sleep in a sleep cycle. As a matter of fact, the 4 stages of the half cycle of the Yuga have correlations to the 4 stages of the sleep cycle of a human. But actually, the more direct parallel is to the sleep cycle of a dolphin. A dolphin experiences something called unihemispheric sleep. This is why a dolphin doesn't drown when it sleeps.
Oh, right, yeah.
Half of its brain goes to sleep while the other half stays awake.
Huh.
So the whole dynamic of communication between non-materiality and materiality that has aspects that relate to our own sleep and our own dreams looks as if we have a single consciousness that is going through a sleep cycle.
Huh. Okay, that's really interesting.
Now, Kabbalism flatly says it. They identify what they call a primordial individual that they don't deify. This is a primordial consciousness, and the Dogon system represents that. The Buddhist and Hindu systems imply that what we're dealing with, Tibetan Buddhism calls it the mind itself. There's an ancient Egyptian word that Budge interprets to be pronounced Sa, that represents a primordial individual associated with Orion. Non-deified, but represented symbolically by the left and the right eye symbols, the eye of Horus and the eye of Ra. This was commonly painted on the wooden coffins of high-ranking Egyptian officials. We find it when we open these tombs. We very often find these 2 eyes painted on the coffin of the person who was buried. In Dogon phonetics, the phonetic value that associates with non-materiality is Si, S-I, as in Sirius. And the phonetic that associates with materiality is Ra, as in the sun god of Egypt.
Okay.
Those are also the phonetics that associate with these 2 eyes. And so, more properly, what Budge interpreted as Sa, but nobody knows for sure how the glyph should be pronounced, from my point of view, should be pronounced Sirah, which is Sirah, a term that associates with Islam. It's a proper name that I believe belongs to this primordial individual.
Well, I guess, too, as far as messages go, a lot of times what you see in so many of these messages are warnings about the environment and things like that. And we've been seeing that cross weird paranormal stuff for decades now.
Right. Well, there's a perspective from which, when we entered the domain of atomic weaponry, it's not certain that when an atomic bomb explodes, it's not doing damage non-materially.
Yeah.
Okay, now if so, then that suddenly provides us with a motive for why there would be so many UFO encounters centered on nuclear facilities and nuclear weapons facilities, and why there have been so many incidents where someone has tried to use a nuclear weapon and they've been circumstances have prevented them from doing it.
Right.
Either the bomb doesn't explode or some odd circumstance comes around where the missile silo is shut down. They can't operate the missile silo or whatever it might happen to be. There have been at least 2 circumstances where live atomic bombs have been accidentally dropped out of aircraft over U.S. cities.
Really? Really?
But in both cases, the bomb inexplicably didn't explode, even though it was armed.
I did not know that. That's really interesting.
Yep. So I can imagine that someone who's in complete command of the timeline, I mean, the difference in timeline effect between the non-material side and the material side, I compare to the difference between, the material side is like a cassette tape, that if you didn't have a fast forward button, the only way to get to a song on a cassette tape is to play it through till you get to it.
Right.
It's linear time. A CD, it compares to time on the non-material side, where you could skip around to whatever piece you want to listen to.
Hmm.
So I can imagine someone in a position who experiences time the way we experience a CD might deliberately go back and interfere with events that had the potential to create damage on the non-material side.
That makes sense.
And from that point of view, then all this threat of nuclear destruction is less of a worry because there's an adult in the room who's looking out for
it. We can hope. So we're almost out of time, but one of the things I wanted to ask you is, what do you think is one of the most misunderstood things about your work?
I don't really look at it that way. I don't really look at it as misunderstanding. I know that, the Dogons say that trying to communicate knowledge to anybody, to any human, is like tugging on wild grass. Wild grass tugs back. And so the Dogon sort of self-deprecatingly refer to themselves as wild grass because they know that it's in human nature to resist anything that you don't intuitively immediately want to believe as being true.
Right. Right.
So it is that aspect of human nature that's probably the hurdle to try to find a way to get over. And the only way I can think of to try to get over it is to try to reduce things down to such an intuitive comparison or an intuitive example that a person can't help but see the point.
And I'm sure there are people still, with all the work you've done and all the detail you've put into showing these connections, who still just think you're making like much ado about nothing.
Right. Well, I mean, my role is no different than the role of a crop circle. That these figures appear that any thinking person should understand have meaning to them, and yet only a very small portion of the population will give any attention to it at all. So if you approach it from that standpoint, you realize from the outset that the idea is to put it out there. The idea is not that hundreds of thousands of people are going to embrace it.
Okay. All right. That makes a lot of sense too. As does all your work, honestly. You've done such an astounding job with this, and it's such a unique piece of work. I mean, it dovetails with other stuff, but I mean, this cosmological plan is not something that anybody else has really dug into.
Well, a lot of people have gotten different pieces of it.
Yeah.
I've been just in the lucky position to have an opportunity to see an overview of it at a time when the science was right to understand what they were talking about. I mean, Champion and Thomas Young, who did the work on the hieroglyphs, knew intuitively there was more going on here than what they could sort out. But the science of their era was not advanced enough for them to figure it out.
All right.
It's luck of the draw for me to a certain extent. Just I happen to be in the right era with the right sources.
And something seems to be pushing you in that direction as well.
Yeah, well, I mean, the first thing a person in my field of study learns is that there are things going on we can't explain. And as soon as you allow that possibility, then all sorts of interesting things start to happen.
All right. The new book is Primal Wisdom of the Ancients, the cosmological plan for humanity. You are Laird Scranton.
Yeah.
This is out on Inner Traditions. Your previous book was self-published.
Right.
And all your stuff is still available if people want to really track down. How many books are in this series now?
This is the 11th of the series. The 12th will be self-published sometime the end of this year.
Okay. All right. Where can people find more information on you?
The easiest place to find me is on Facebook.
Okay.
I'm the only Laird Scranton on Facebook. I joke that they shouldn't confuse me with all the other Laird Scrantons, but there aren't any. That's the easiest place to find me, or through my publisher, through innertraditions.com. There's a Laird Scranton page, or through simonandschuster.com. There's a Laird Scranton page.
And the self-published book is where? On Amazon?
The self-published books are immediately available on Amazon all over the world, but they can be ordered through any bookstore also.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for spending this time with us, Laird. It's always a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you very much for having me on. It's always a pleasure to talk to you.
I want to take a moment here to give a shout out to all my patrons. All of you help make this show possible. I want to give a special shout out to those of you pledging $10 or more: Frank Earl, Nagatha Christie, Patricia W., Barbara Fisher, Will Powell, Big Boy Limina, Craig Parmenter, Walker, Joanna Rojas, Maddie, David Moore, Vincent Trewill, The Great Change, Sam Sharon, Stone Wilderness, Luke Osborne, Becky Trainer, Rob Drummond, Alex Whitcomb, Edu Camahort, Tactical Therapist, Janet Bunderson, 36 Dingo, Taylor, Jennifer Campbell, American Rambler, Kevin, John Rutledge Foster, Eric Citron, Andy McNamara, Sasha Jorg, Matthias Sunby, Dominic O'Malley, Christopher Vaughn, Super Inframan, Riker and Stark, Tim, J. Otto Bullitt, Kevin Shrek, Jose A., Roger Gonzalez, Craig Cicernos, Ray Benedetto, Linz Jackson K., Ellison Cook, Alfred Tuttle, James Lattimore, Patricia Giaquinta, William Lovelace, Mark Brady, and Carla Mahoney. Thank you so much for helping make this show possible. I hope you enjoyed that. It's always a pleasure having Laird on. There is no Patreon segment for this. However, I will be uploading my talk from the Strange Realities Conference for Patreon, so you'll be able to check that out. On the Facebook page, I'm also running a poll asking where you listen to Where Did the Road Go most often. So if you're a part of the Facebook page, go check that out and give me a vote. It helps me understand where people are hearing the show more versus less. I mean, I know it's a small snippet of everyone that's listening, but I hope it's somewhat representative. And actually, I should say Facebook group. There is a Facebook page and a Facebook group. The poll is in the Facebook group. So feel free to like us on Facebook on the Facebook page and join our group. And if you're listening somewhere where you can rate or review us, a positive review, a positive rating goes a long way on some of these services, especially things like iTunes. So anything like that is always greatly appreciated. We also have merch. It's available both on YouTube. Under the videos, you'll see a selection of merch. And it's available from the website. If you go to wheredidtheroadgo.com, it'll take you to TeePublic, where we have a bunch of shirts and other things, coffee mugs, all kinds of stuff, with various Where Did the Road Go designs. I'll see you next time. You have been listening to Where Did the Road Go? This show is made possible in part from our Patreons, and we thank you and everyone listening for helping us continue this exploration of the strange. You can always find everything Where Did the Road Go related at www.wheredidtheroadgo.com. And thank you so much for your support.